All yours, guys.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, CitizenCon. So we are here to talk Xi'an. I'll be basically covering a little bit of the backstory and how they developed as a culture and sort of a character, and mostly actually in collaboration with the various other departments within the company. So let's get started. Basically, the moment of being tasked with creating a civilization, there was one question that sort of popped into my head immediately, which was that, and abject fear and terror. But once it ended, basically, it was a very simple question of who are they? That sort of thing seems like a very obvious and silly approach, but it actually can give you a lot of good answers. And so in the early days when Chris and I were sort of talking about the initial framework for what would become the Star Citizen universe, we had the big four of the alien species. There's the Xi'an, the Banu, the Tavaran, and the Vandal. And so the idea was to basically kind of arrange them in a lineup and, along with humans, and try and figure out sort of like what each of them would bring to sort of the game and sort of the environment, universe, and fiction in general. So these are basically our sort of five main ones. Well, them too. And basically to kind of tackle it, again, it's a big question. Who are they? Who are each of these five? And these are cultures, civilizations. So to sort of approach it, I actually kind of used an analogy that I'd picked up when I was a kid. I read How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, which is an excellent book if you're trying to learn how to draw. But the sort of approach that they taught was you start out with sort of shapes, very, very rough shapes, just to kind of get form and silhouette and stuff. And then you refine it, so you get more detailed as you work your way in. And so that was sort of the kind of approach that we tried with this, because the win with it was that once you kind of establish sort of the basic kind of tone and character, like the specific stuff, you can kind of forget because you're keeping in mind kind of who they are as a culture. So like I could, forget which Xi'an house controlled the second dynasty, but if I remember who the Xi'an are and why they were in that sort of era of their history that they were, I can kind of keep developing stuff for it. So to kind of tackle it, basically, with each of these cultures, I sort of tried using terms to kind of identify them. So we'll just kind of run through them real quick. So the Banu, obviously, the traders. They're the ones who are sort of, that sort of very rich trading history and culture and stuff like that. The Tavaran, the Ronin, the sort of warrior race that had sort of fallen from grace, sort of honorable warrior type thing that's sort of in tragic times. The Vandal, of course, are just straight up warriors because they will just murder. And the Xi'an were the diplomats. So, one thing to notice is that you can kind of get a sense of like kind of what each of these cultures represents just on a surface level, and you'll notice that none of this is involving any kind of, physical descriptors or anything. It's not the lizard people or their ghosts or whatever. It's very evocative, and it's supposed to kind of give you a sense of the tone of the character of the culture. And with that approach, it actually was really helpful, because then once we kind of put out this information to the art team and the design and stuff like that, like they could sort of work with it in sort of a more abstract way and sort of and come up with kind of cool things that would contribute to the thing. So for the Xi'an, they're basically, forgot about that. So this was the initial sentence that we used to describe their culture. And with the hope of it being a very singularly evocative kind of sentence that really kind of sums up who they are and what they want. And so that was it. That's what basically we kind of used to give to the teams to kind of start their work and build ships and characters and clothes and planets and all that stuff. And the work that they would do, we would bring back into the lore. So we would help reconstruct the lore to incorporate all that stuff so there was a reason. So it's a kind of a wonderfully cyclical pattern. So, for example, there's this concept of verticality that you'll see with a lot of the sort of the Xi'an ships. And it was actually, I think, in the original design of the Kartual scout ship where that first kind of popped up. And and it became sort of a driving element in the culture, as far as the ships and in the buildings, and as Britton will kind of get into, like even the formation of the language and stuff like that. So basically we come back to this initial question of, who are they? And you guys all know, who they are. But over the past 8 months, actually, it's been a really exciting time, specifically for the Xi'an, because working with Josh and working with Britton, as we've been developing like the characters and the language and stuff like that, it's been forcing us to ask a lot of really kind of interesting questions that you don't normally kind of see in a standard gameplay mission type thing. And it's really like exploded, basically, as sort of like a really, really rich culture. And so as part of those conversations, what we did was we actually used a similar thing that we did during the initial push to the GDC announcement of Star Citizen, where we created time capsules. So it was one per day, and each one sort of charted humanity's progression from modern day to the games era, so the 30th century. Like, what are the major historical, cultural, political events that pushed us to be where we are in 2947. So we actually did that again, but with the Xi'an this time, and created a list that basically, and unfortunately have a lifespan of centuries, so the timeline was a lot longer, like 30,000 years of history longer. So obviously we could try and go over all of it right now if you wanted, but probably shouldn't. So just to give you a sense of like kind of what's come out of that, we actually gave them a homeworld. Back in the early days, if you remember, I think it was in the writer's guide, we had actually sort of said that the Xi'an were very cagey about where they came from because of this whole distrust with humans. They didn't want to kind of tip their hand as to sort of where their homeworld was. And we actually, once we kind of looked again, like at the lineup of all of our sort of big four, realized that there's nothing really known about the Vandal. The Tavaran homeworld's been assimilated by the UEE, and the Banu don't even remember where they came from. So it was like all of our alien species had no homeworld. So we basically decided, like, all right, let's build up a homeworld, and we'll kind of flesh that out. So the initial idea was that it was this sort of dense kind of like jungle, very warm type thing. And actually, one of the things Will had come up with when he was working on some docs for the Xi'an was that they actually eat carrion, and they'd like really spicy food, and it's kind of, to us, it's kind of disgusting. And so what we did was we actually, like, to justify that, again, we wove it back into like how do we kind of move backwards from it? So why do they eat carrion? And so we came up with this idea that basically they were sort of not on the top of the food chain for a really long time. Like, there were a lot of predators on their homeworld, and so they had to sort of be cautious and eat kind of the scraps that were left behind by other predators because they couldn't get the food themselves. And so it was kind of a wonderful moment because it was, again, another example of kind of how the process kind of can feed itself back into it, because that idea basically reinforces the original notion of that we had said in that first description of that they're cautious and patient in their negotiations because they're very just they've had to evolve as a very defensive species. And so that's the thing that's really fun, like those moments where, like, we're talking with the art team and we're talking with the design team, and they come up with something that's really cool, and it just infuses the whole process together, and these things really start to reinforce and challenge each other, and lead to really fascinating discussions. We actually just last week we had a conversation with Jeremiah in LA because we had the question of how do Xi'an sleep? Which, from a game perspective, you're never really necessarily going to see, or isn't that kind of important, but it was a fascinating conversation with, once you start factoring in where they came from, what their society's like, do they just lay down, and do they stand, do they sit, it was really interesting, and it just makes them feel like a really living, breathing species. So, again, the don't live there anymore, I'll get into it a little bit, but it was basically, we kind of cheated them. We gave them a homeworld, and then we took it away from them. So that was kind of on me. I made that one up. So the second thing, basically, is that we had mentioned in the original Meet the Xi'an thing that we had done years ago was that there's mandatory service within the culture. And so you guys have heard about the Emperor Krei, who's sort of obviously the leader of the Xi'an. But one of the other aspects that we ended up coming up with was that the Xi'an is basically, houses are very important to them. Your family line is very, very important. It's tracked through the mothers, and basically the houses can be also corporations, which is really, really fun, and gives them a really kind of unique spin on what a business is as compared to what a human business is. And so we worked in this idea that this mandatory service that the Xi'an have to perform is actually them joining the emperor's family, basically. So they join the emperor's line, they give up their own name during their period of mandatory service, and with the idea that there was basically this huge war between all the houses that almost destroyed the species and caused the destruction of their homeworld. And so they basically said, all right, we're going to take the military and take it away, and the security, and take it away from all these guys, and we're going to consolidate it, and we're going to establish an emperor, and basically take them, Xi'an, when they're young, and raise them up in this so they get a sense of, they have a sort of affinity for the emperor and the emperor's line and stuff like that, so they're less likely to fight each other. So again, it's just, this is the type of stuff that through the course of these conversations, we're writing up and then we're putting out to the teams and stuff like that. And then we're getting feedback on designs and weapons and ships and stuff like that. And then so we're sort of taking it, reincorporating it back in the lore, and it becomes kind of this kind of wonderful symbiotic process. And it's, basically kind of what we'll do kind of with each of the civilizations moving forward. And I mean, you'll notice again that I didn't mention at all what they looked like, that it's still trying to keep that thing of letting the artists be artists and come up with the stuff and not kind of hemming them in with sort of arbitrary lore rules that we just sort of made up that would be fun. It's like, we wanted to make sure that people could kind of fuel their own creativity and find their own hook into it and stuff like that, which is really exciting. But to get into exactly how the Xi'an look, I will turn over to Mr. Josh Herman.
Thank you. That's a very good segue.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I'll get into some of the visuals of just designing the Xi'an. Obviously, I came onto the project a little later, after some of the initial stuff had been done. But one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit before we get into the visuals was some of what Dave talked about, which was the concept of a lineup. And so as we have here, have the Vandul, the Banu, the Tavarn, and the Xi'an, as well as the humans. The humans are kind of the jack of all trades. They're kind of the neutral. They're like we talked about before this, actually. In D&D, if you play in D&D, the humans are kind of like, they get like extra plus somewhere else, extra skill point somewhere. But I think that concept also works with everything else. So like, how will the future aliens fit into this? We don't really know. But I use this example a lot. I found this online. It was actually from a graphic designer. But I don't know if any of you guys can tell what this is from. This is not from our game. This is from another game, a very popular game. Does anybody know what this is from? Boom, Street Fighter. So basically, the concept of a lineup is basically saying that you have all these things that are going to be put together, but you need to be able to distinguish each one of them as an individual. And just by looking at this, I can tell you who Ken is, I can tell you who Blanca is, I can tell you who each one of these characters are. And that's because they're so distinctive in their colors, or at least their reeds and silhouettes and proportions, that you can tell who they are. And so we want to be able to do that with our characters, right? This is our lineup of our big four plus one. And so we have, this is kind of the current of where everybody is. So we have our Vandul the warrior, we have our Ronin and the Tavarn, we have our traders in the Banu, we have our humans there, and then we have our Xi'an, who we're kind of talking about today. Now, just some brief takeaways going off what Dave said. Obviously nothing he said had what the visuals were. Some key things he had was that it's not a predator, or because they eat carrion, which I think is actually a really important thing, which we'll talk about in a second. Speaking with Britton, as he's developing the language, we learned that certain shapes would require certain mouth shapes, so they would need to have I believe was the one. Yeah, being able to have that mouth shape, which means they need to have lips, which does clarify some specific design things for you. They're also very good in the technology. They developed the anti-grav technology, and they also have a very long lifespan. So when we kind of start taking that in, carrion, just a quick Wikipedia example of what carrion is and what kind of animals would eat carrion. This is what I would do when I would get this design brief or the high-level brief from Dave. I would Google it, and I would say, what other things eat carrion? Why would they eat carrion? And that's a big example. So as we go down the list here, all of these technically are a predator. A lot of them are predators, but they're not the apex predator, right? They're not at the top of the chain. So what I wanted to bring into the newer designs, and this is all still stuff that we're working on, was a sense that they could have some muscle to them, that they could have some meat to them, but they're not at the top. And so as we start looking at their food, so what kind of foods could they eat? Do they eat just raw meat? Is it just, they eat carrion, so that's old? How does that transition as they become a higher society? Maybe they still like that. Carrion is essentially rotting meat or old meat. So maybe that's very similar to fermented foods. So we talked about that. So fermented food is something maybe that they would be interested in eating. So we look at a lot of different types of fermented foods, a lot of cultures that would eat fermented food like Korean food or things like that. And another thing was the anti-grav stuff. So from the 3D world cover that we did a couple months ago, something that I didn't actually portray well enough is that his collar there is actually floating. So something that we'll be able to do with them that we can't do necessarily with other races is have a lot of anti-grav technology just in their costumes and who they are. Just kind of going through our lineage of where we're at now, right? I came on right after the middle one was done there. And so it's important as we progress that we don't necessarily make like a drastic change, right? We want to keep true with what everything's going. If we need to retcon something, we can do that, but it's not something we want to do at every opportunity. We want to keep it consistent. And I think that's, going back to the Marvel way that you were talking about, how typically you work in the broad shape first, and then you go into the details. And that's something you do for a whole race as well. We're not going to try to nail it on the first shot. We're not going to go and maybe try to make the perfect image the first time. We're going to do a lot of images and see what sticks, and we're going to go back to those, see what were successful, and kind of move on. So these are just some of the high-level things that we start looking at. So just doing silhouettes, starting to see the characters in situation. What situation means is basically what they look like in their home worlds. What do they look like when they're kind of natural? So we start looking at how would an old Xi'an look? How would a young one look? How would a short one look? How would a tall one look? Do they walk different? Do they need canes? Are they just kind of simple things as to how they start moving? Just very simple keyframes. All this is to kind of capture the mood. To kind of capture the mood, see what strikes us, try to make a compelling image, find what works, build on that, and lose what doesn't work. So again, now we're kind of just exploring the idea of scale, of size, of environment. We can also work in some ideas for costumes, ideas for proportions. There's been talk of whether, obviously we've had some turtle reference, and so do we want to have shells on them? Is that a thing we want? Do we want to try to put that in there? Do we not want to put that in there? Maybe it's just in the costume. Maybe they used to. Maybe it's vestigial. We talk about all these conversations of, how they could have this or how they wouldn't have this. Is this something that we really want to incorporate or not? While we're doing this, we're also looking into interactions between them. Because that can inform your decisions. Even in a simple painting like this, I think this was done by one of the concept artists, Michael. There's kind of a face mask. Is that something that they would wear all the time? Is that their actual face? So we get to explore a lot of these things as we do these rough paintings to explore them. Obviously, this is the Scout. So what do they look like in the Scout? We've never seen one in there. And I think it's important to note as I'm going through these that this isn't necessarily like the final design. This is us exploring ideas. This is us exploring their culture. Just being able to kind of explore more about them. So we've obviously, like you were talking about before, that it's really important, the families. So maybe we're exploring the idea of like some sort of a parade or a ceremony or something that the top of the top are having. Family units, so old, young, male, female. Is there a difference between male and female as far as what they look like? Some animals, mammals have differences, some don't. Like a lot of dogs and cats are very similar, maybe just sizes. But then when you look at like big cats, like lions, those are completely different, right? You can have a clear male, you have a separate female. So this is, I think this is one of the explorations for the Council of Three, I believe.
Yeah.
And so you can see in these, even all the faces are different, all the costumes are slightly different. And that's kind of intentional, right? We're not necessarily trying to say like, remember this face I made for the cover, make sure that all the faces look like that face, because that's not the intent of this. So we did this image for a series that Britton is developing, but costumes, they're buying costumes. What would their shops look like? What could their costumes look like? How do they sleep, right? Kind of conversations of that. I think in this conversation we're talking about maybe them being backed up against stuff. Maybe that's part of them still not being at the top of the predator. They need to feel like they're comfortable, that they're protected. The little one on the right, yeah. Exploring how we could maybe bring in some of the elements of their ships. So you see some of the heads on the left, they have some little decorative gold and trims on them. How can we make that but not make it feel tribal? If we want to bring in this element to them so they feel high-tech as just a race, because they are very high-tech, but we don't want it to necessarily feel like they're just tribal, because that seems to lower them in the where they would be. Yeah. And now let's talk about some language.
Okay, deal. It's really easy, I promise. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, and I'm going to tell you about the T-shirt I'm wearing. I want there to be some time for Q&A, so I'm going to kind of plow through it quickly. And one of the reasons I can do that is because today we are launching a whole set on Spectrum with documents and videos, and if you want to know more about this, you can rush to your Wi-Fi and learn all about it very, very quickly. One of the biggest chunks of this, oops, we had a technical click malfunction.
Try one more time.
Can we go back? It's okay. There's a big document. The thing is over 130 pages. And there are also videos, and I hope sound is going to play.
Shesulen esen Brittonua. Tinyatoyan sesea weyai anyanai with washanethlea. Otwethling sia yau. Ti poyaya yau. Huityung hoa. Otian we with. Word order in sentences. Being, doing, and having. Asking and answering questions. Defining relationships between words and phrases. The basic word order in Xi'an is VSO.
So, a whole series of videos starting today. If you're chomping at the bit to learn how to greet a Xi'an or have a drink with one, then go check it out. It's all on the forum on Spectrum. You can find me on the forum as @Xenolinguist. And to give you an example of grammar and what's going on with the language, I want to talk to you about what's on my shirt. So Dave has mentioned that, the Xi'an are the diplomats. They're not necessarily, they're not necessarily party animals, but that doesn't mean that they aren't party animals either. You don't know what's necessarily going on after the conference is over, or maybe in the last hour of the conference. So on this shirt, we have a piece of Xi'an slang, and I'm going to step you through how it actually works as a language. This is not gobbledygook. This is a real language, folks, and if you want to learn it, it's going to take some time, but it'll give you something to do while you're not shooting down other players. So my shirt says "Echikao sho mama," and it's written on this shirt in some calligraphy. But of course, these are spacefaring people with a 10,000, 20,000 plus year history, so they have all kinds of different ways to write. So you can learn to read in one style or the other. We're going to go kind of simple and straightforward and modern, and learn again that this is pronounced "Echikao sho mama." So you might hear my voice jumping around a little bit. There's pitch in the language because a lot of the inspiration was from Asia, the vertical writing and some of the pronunciation and grammar. We start with a verb, which by itself doesn't mean very much, but it tells you it's a verb. And so we're being at somewhere. But again, real language is rich and complex, so we're going to talk about being specifically here, which is the word kao. So ekao means to be here in a place. And we're going to explain that where we are is in the house. Shou is pronounced, this character, and XYO is the romanization, is pronounced house. So is here in the house somebody? And chi is a grammatical particle that I don't think you have in German, and we definitely don't have it in English, but it refers to an inflection, some kind of change. So in this case, we're going to translate this as now. It's not really easy to translate into English, but that's what we'll do here. So we have echi kao sho mama. Now, mama is probably not what you think it is. I'll give you a hint. Ma is a root in the language that essentially means animal. So, for example, ma'a is fauna, and maten is edible meat or carrion. Yalma is a sentient animal, some animal that can recognize you and it can recognize it and have a relationship with that animal. Maybe it's just petting it if it's a pet. And this final word, mama, is a slang term that comes from the service dialect of the language. And it means his or her animal. And it's referring to your metaphorical inner animal. So we'll translate it in English as beast. So the shirt is saying essentially, is now here in the house beast. But the smooth translation for that is the beast is in the house. And the grammar is very specifically verb, then subject in the language. And here's the beast. Now, Josh designed the beast. And I don't know exactly why this guy's a beast. Maybe it's because he's a ruthless general, or maybe it's because he really knows how to order cocktails. But this is the beast, and I'm sure that he is among us somewhere in the house. And I expect to see him among you later. Thanks very much.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks, guys. So the beast is in the house, huh?
You look kind of beastly.
Hey. We're all friends here, man. I kind of walked into that one, didn't I? So now we have time for Q&A. We've got a good 15 minutes or so for Q&A, which is awesome. I'm going to start it off. Sorry. But seeing this process that you guys go through, right? That's what's the background, what's the visual, what's the language, and you can kind of see that as a template, right, or a working atmosphere. Do you see this as a standard template that you would apply for the next civilization, or so on or so on? Is that something then that would be applied, or what could be tweaked based off of other variables?
You want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I hope so. It takes time, but it's a fun back and forth because you're getting there's a lot of creative people, so you want to get the best out of them and, and give them an opportunity to be creative, like I said earlier. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's wonderful to kind of see people feed off of just simple descriptions and come up with like really fascinating, alien things, which is really fun.
Yeah, I would agree. I think for me, I love working in a collaborative environment and also a very iterative environment. So where you're able to talk to each other, work on something, then come back together, have that conversation, iterate on it, and keep going. So I think it is definitely something like that.
Yeah, I can't create a language without knowing about a culture and about physicality. I mean, how many joints are in the arm, you need to know about those things. So we with the Xi'an have been having lots of conversations, and we write things and we share them among the writing team, and we refine things, and some ideas drop out, and the rest of it I then have to go make verbs for.
Cool, thanks. Let's open it up for the audience. Where's our guys with mics?
There's one right there, dead center.
Sorry.
I have a question regarding the other languages. Will you also get the translations and those tutorials for the other languages?
I think that is in the plan. I mean, I am working right now feverishly on Xi'an and fleshing it out, and I'll be spending time on the forum with the other people who want to learn it. But Dave or somebody else can also speak to the future if he wants to.
Yeah, I mean, the plan is to do full languages for the various species. I mean, as far as like which ones are more accessible. We're actually kind of keeping in fiction with that. So like, the Vandal, obviously there's no diplomatic relations. So it's, it's not easy for a human being to conceivably learn it. Not to say that it's impossible, but just like, it's probably a lot of guesswork because you're not going to have a Vandal sit there and talk it out with you. He'll just kill you. But so like for the Banu, it feels like, it's definitely a possibility.
Okay, thank you.
He's making his way with the mic.
Hello, hola. Here, over here at the end. Hola. Hello. Okay, just ask. So many games we've seen like different races that are enrolled in like the traders, the workers, like very specific. So when you talk about this, you find a way that is not like everywhere. You always find this Banu that is always traders, or this race that is always like very encapsulated, like they can be also warriors and things like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, it's kind of one of the great things that when talking about this earlier on with Chris, that he had said about the UEEs, that he didn't want this sort of evil empire, like very black and white type morality type thing for the humans, and I think it also kind of applies with the races too. It's because particularly for the Xi'an, like one of the things we had talked about was the idea that like while the culture is very rigid and formal and stuff like that, there's actually a youth culture that sort of likes the impetuousness of humans. The fact that we are very emotional and we get riled up about stuff and we get angry and stuff like that, that they've actually, in the course of their interactions with us, have kind of like that. And so there's this sort of counterculture within the Xi'an where the kids are basically kind of acting out and being a lot more like sticking it to the man, type thing, which is...
The 40-year-old kids, because they live 3
well,
years.
yeah, naturally. But yeah, I mean, I think but hopefully that's what kind of helps, distinguish each of the cultures of not just, because again, like you use that as a launching point, like the traders and the Ronin diplomat, like it's always a launching point. It's how do you challenge that as well? Like, how do you flesh it out and make it feel believable, but also what are the elements in the culture that don't line up with that? And again, sort of challenge the expectations.
Yeah, because you can't have a fully fledged culture without those other aspects. Like
Yeah.
if they're just the warriors and that's all they do, that's not necessarily true, right?
And
Like,
or interesting.
yeah, exactly. It's kind of
kinda
boring
tune
at
out.
that point. So I mean, even when it's like the Xi'an, like yeah, they're the diplomats, but they've also had all these historical wars, which means they've also fought, which means technically they're also warriors.
Right.
So you have to like really start, and that means they also have trade and they have all like things to protect. So it's every culture and every race is fleshed out. It's not just the archetype.
Right.
Will it be possible that we have a translation of Xi'an Interactive on the Robot Space Industries website? Just a translator, like Google Translator?
You're talking about live
Yes.
translation of everything that
Just
comes up.
using words, and it's going to be automatically translating in Xi'an language?
I won't speak to future technology in the game, but I mean, if everybody wants it to go in that direction, everybody being all of you or all of them and everybody back there, that's possible because it's a grammatical language. It's a full language, and there's still words to be added. Sitting here, I realize I need a word for bright, but it could work. I mean, you could have a Google Translate. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know.
Well, not on Google, but on the Robot Space Industries website, on the Spectrum or whatever.
Well, the language, as of a couple of hours from now, you'll be able to go look at the dictionary. It has 900 items in it. It's on the website.
All right.
But whether there's ever going to be any kind of technical live translation of anything going on in the game or online or anything, I think is a question mark. I don't know about that. But you can go start learning Xi'an today. Otue, go do it. Let's do it. Yeah.
But when you are communicating with an officer of Xi'an, while you are driving or flying your ship, is there a possibility to have a display when the Xi'an is talking, and you can read the lines what he's talking about? Is that also possible?
It could happen, sure. I mean, there are various typefaces already.
Will be nice.
Ones appropriate for computer monitors exist. But I would encourage you, if you would like to see that in the game, to come to the forum and engage with us and let us know how you want to see Xi'an as a linguistic experience broaden and deepen your experience in the game.
Will be nice. Okay.
I would have two questions about the linguistic of Xi'an. Well, one. How would you class in comparison to other languages? Like I heard you created Xi'an based on Asian languages. How would you classify the language, like how to say, how hard you would think it is to learn, like compared to other languages that we currently have?
Okay. Well, it's not, the grammar is not exactly based on Asian languages. There's some things that are inspired by Asian languages, specifically by Thai and Mandarin, in that the words don't change shape. They don't conjugate. You don't get I want, she wants. That doesn't happen. So from that perspective, the words are very simple. Once you learn the word and you learn what happens when two words come together in a compound, it's pretty easy to predict what that word is. You don't have to learn any kind of complex morphology. The language is maybe somewhat more difficult to learn than a typical Indo-European language if you're coming from a European background, because it does have pitch that goes up and down. You have to learn to hear the difference between what's a good pitch example? E and E. So those are two different words. E is plant material, and E is some kind of precision. Is some kind of selection. So you do have to learn to hear things differently. But it's not a particularly difficult language to learn, I would claim. The way the pieces and parts of a sentence fit together are quite different from English or German. But unlike German, the verb always comes at the beginning. So there's certain rules like that once you learn them, they're very straightforward.
Sorry, just really quick. So it's going to be the last question, just because we have to move on to the next one. But these guys are going to be here. No, feel free to finish your question, but this will be the last one for this panel.
Thank you. It would be more of a personal question to you. And it would be about the fact of learning your job, like your career parkour, yeah. Like, what kind of jobs is there if you have a linguistic degree of some sort?
Well, I'm an armchair linguist. I mean, I worked in high tech for many, many years and started doing constructed languages just about 6 years ago. So I think that if you are interested in tackling working on constructing languages, I would first go explore that world, because there's a whole world of people out there who create languages. And some of those people end up doing it professionally. You know, they end up collaborating with a writing team like Dave's or a design team like Josh's. But the first thing is to learn about the world that is out there of people who invent languages. And from that, you will find different avenues into maybe pursuing it as a partial career.